Assalamu alaikum, it's me, Amir A Nasr, again, host and the curator of the Future of Islam in the Age of New Media. And today my guest is the Associate Editor of Religion Dispatches, Haroon Moghul, who's currently busy doing his PhD at the University of Columbia. And his PhD actually deals with Islamic philosophy and political thought. So Haroon, welcome, and thank you for doing this.
Assalamu alaikum, thanks for having me.
All right, so actually let's dive right into things. In your 1-minute take, you talked about how the internet is a destabilizing force and how you believe there is currently a crisis of authority in the Muslim world, and how there are many, too many in fact, religious figures who believe themselves to be authoritative when they're in fact authoritarian. And what we need is religious figures who can navigate traditional and modern worldviews and who are authoritative and not authoritarian. So, a number of really important, insightful points that you mentioned there. So let's start with the first one. Why do you think the internet is going to be a destabilizing force?
That's a big question, of course. I think with the way the internet works is what we're doing is we're connecting people who otherwise wouldn't talk, and we're making it possible for people to respond to authoritative conversations that they wouldn't have been able to do before. So, as an example, if you have a journalist, we saw this a lot during the Arab Spring, a journalist who says something about the Arab world that's incorrect, 20 years ago maybe the most you could do is write a letter to the editor.
Right.
You couldn't call them out publicly immediately and get that kind of retraction or response. So if you take that kind of trend and magnify it on a global scale and talk about all these different people now coming together and being exposed to each other's points of view, and then being able to talk to each other, because this isn't just I have satellite TV, I can now watch what someone's watching in another continent at the same time as they're watching it. It's I can respond to them at the same time. What that does is it creates instability because it challenges institutions that have never been challenged that way. I also think the internet makes possible some economic processes which I think people in the Western world especially find unsettling. So if you can outsource people with that level of instantaneous contact, then you don't need to create jobs in your backyard. You can now hire someone on the other end of the world to do the job for you. And I think our conversation, in a sense, is a good example of that. You're on the other side of the planet, we're having a conversation, and we are not part of some elite power structure. We're just everyday people, and that is, I think, the ultimate destabilization of the internet.
So it seems that when you initially talked about the internet as a destabilizing force in your 1-minute take, kind of came across as a negative sort of destabilization. But what I'm hearing now is sort of a positive destabilization. Is that correct?
I think there's negatives and positives. I think more than anything, it depends on where you were before the internet became a ubiquitous part of our experience. So for people in the Western world, I think the internet has challenged a lot of assumptions. There was a great article by a professor at Columbia, Hamid Dabashi, on Al Jazeera, I think maybe a few weeks back, and he had the point that a lot of the people who've been talking about the Arab Spring presume themselves to be cosmopolitan, but they've been revealed to be extremely provincial. The definition we used to get of someone who was cosmopolitan was someone who knew what was happening in New York or London, not someone who was really familiar with the rest of the planet. So in that sense, it really depends on where you were beforehand. For people who did not have access to power, this can be very empowering, and it's a destabilization that pushes them into people's consciousness. But for people who are used to being unchallenged, this is suddenly a kind of instability that threatens their sense of self and their whole idea of the way the world works.
And their authority.
Definitely, definitely.
Okay, so on the issue of authority, I think it's easy to sort of look at a person and sort of judge and say, you know what, this guy has a very authoritarian approach. It's not like, straightforward. Obviously, there's going to be some disagreements, but it's easier to discern. However, how would you assess if a religious scholar is authoritative when already in the Muslim world, even before the internet, you have so many different sects and communities, all over the planet who, for sure, they agree on core issues, that are central to Islam, but they have very contentious, heated debates about other issues, especially in the political realm, the role of Sharia Islam and democracy, things like that. So it was already contentious, and things were already heated, when it came to those issues before the internet. And now the diversity is booming even further, and Islam is becoming more eclectic. And as you mentioned earlier, that there are positive aspects to that, but there are also negative aspects, which many of the speakers have commented about during the 1 hour audio seminar. How do you see it, in this increasingly diverse environment? How do we discern who's an authoritative religious figure? Can we do that? Sorry, let me just turn this off. That's my phone. So can we do that in a way that mainstream many Muslims can accept? Because you just said it. These days, a scholar will say something. In the past, he wouldn't be challenged, but now any fatwa, any opinion, even a tweet, on Twitter gets challenged. So it's a new environment. How do we deal with it? How do we deal with this crisis of authority?
Well, we're going to need to start producing our people. And the way to deal with it is to create the types of people who can then respond more effectively to what's going on in the world. So I think in the short term, you are going to see that kind of everybody's responding to everything, and there is a bit of chaos and there's a bit of a mess. But ultimately, when it comes to religion, I think what people look for is stability and consistency. That doesn't mean stability in the sense of being unresponsive. It means a sense of having a larger life purpose and communicating that. So I think that the way to respond to what the internet is doing is to educate and sustain and develop and push out a group of people who are capable of engaging multiple audiences. So the difference between someone who's authoritative and authoritarian, I think, comes down to this, especially in the new media age. Someone who's authoritative within a tradition can move into other spheres as an equal voice, as an equal participant in conversations. But someone who's merely authoritarian is not going to be able to do that because they're not going to be able to handle the challenge. So, an easy example is someone who's a popular religious scholar who's authoritative more than he or she is authoritarian. That person may not have instant credibility or authority among all the different kinds of audiences that are out there on Twitter or Facebook or whatever, but they will be able to engage them intelligently, intellectually, respectfully, and meaningfully as another participant in a global conversation. Someone who's only used to being listened to because essentially their model of authority is you have to listen to me is not going to be able to be part of a global conversation. They're just going to be ignored. Or they're going to really just draw the wrath of new media onto themselves because of their irrelevance. And I think whether or not someone can really step out of their field of authority and be part of a global conversation is an indicator of that. And I think that's something very important because no one can really be an authority in every single field. If they even try to, they never have time to finish. But at the same time, we do need these kinds of new media conversations where you get someone who's a political scientist, an economist, creative personality, a tech person, and a religious scholar, all of whom are able to have a conversation meaningfully and respectfully.
So therefore, a measure of someone who's authoritative would be a person who can engage different audiences, diverse. They don't necessarily have to agree with him, but he's not engaging in a monologue. He's very conversational. He's able to listen to different views. He's not a dogmatic person. And you're right, such people need to be trained, and that attitude needs to get ingrained in more and more religious scholars. But here's a bit of a provocative question. Don't you think that, many traditionalists or even the conservatives who are not used to this new media environment, do you think they have what it takes to really step up? Do you think they've been catching up fast enough?
I think there are two different kinds of responses among people who are more traditionalist, one of which I respect and one of which I have some concerns about. The one I respect is a response that says that our tradition has developed over a long period of time, and we are emphasizing the elements of continuity. So a scholar may not be very interested in social media, not out of a position of arrogance, but out of a meaningful place of contemplation. Someone whose job it is, for example, to counsel, to shepherd souls, if you will, to be a guide, to be an inspiration, to be a teacher, may find social media irrelevant to themselves or simply not necessary for the work they do. And that's totally cool. I don't think we should assume that being uninterested in social media is a sign that you have nothing to offer or that you are somehow irrelevant to the world. The bigger danger is those who will simply dismiss it out of hand. Not out of a place of, I've looked at this and I've determined whether or not it's relevant for me or how I understand religion, but simply the sense that people who do this are beneath me. And that's a very fine and nuanced point, but you can see it. You can see some very traditional scholars who say, look, my job is to make people more pious and more sacred and bring them along on this journey, and I don't see social media as part of that. And therefore, they're working with their own population, their own audience. But then you have people who immediately just look down on and condemn social media as simply something that smacks of an evil West or a kind of bifurcated world between the good and the evil. And again, you know, I'm not claiming it's an easy point to make, but it is there, and I think that's something to pay attention to.
Right, and those who condemn media as some sort of, you know, Western evil, by doing that, they're actually marginalizing themselves, and they're exposing themselves for, you know, their attitudes. And so I think it'll be very easy to push them out of the debate and just kind of ignore them and see them as irrelevant. But yeah, you're right. I mean, you know, the middle ground, you know, it does have many shades of gray. But philosophically speaking, because, see, the measure of authoritativeness, if I can use that term, will, you know, to a large extent come down to how much that person is immersed in the tradition, right, in the traditional tools. And you mentioned this notion of continuity. And, you know, an aspect of continuity is knowing how to adapt to changing times. So philosophically speaking, and even, you know, from within the tradition itself, the tradition has to adapt in order for it to continue being relevant. But the question of how it does that, it's, I mean, already I'm witnessing many debates within social media and even just in public discourse and academia and books, and, you know, the books that are coming out. It's contentious because within the tradition, you know, like things like, you know, international relations. I mean, you know, you're working on your PhD that deals with Islamic philosophy and political thought. So things like international relations, the issue of Sharia in public life and in government, Islam and democracy. The tradition has a lot of tools that are available to us to use so that we can dissent from within the tradition. But from my experience, many find the tradition to be suffocating. I can say to an extent this has been, you know, my experience, although now, you know, I'm starting to realize that the tradition is actually very broad and diverse. It's not as monolithic as some scholars would like to make it seem. So the philosophical notions themselves are shifting. And you know, the measure of what makes a person authoritative, even that is being destabilized.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think what ultimately preserves the tradition, and I think this is where religion is not just an intellectual conversation, what preserves the tradition is really piety and community. Mm-hmm. And what people can automatically detect and understand and appreciate is someone who's dedicated to their community or communities. There was a pretty good article, I think it was in Islamic Monthly recently. I want to say it was by Hisham Hellier, but I could be wrong. And it was about Ali Guma's response to the Egyptian revolution. Mm-hmm. And initially he had been pretty skeptical of the revolution, and after everything happened, Mubarak was removed from power. People actually changed their opinion of him again because they went back to the original opinion of him, because as he went to the news media, he started saying, look, the reason I was opposed to the revolution wasn't because I was somehow in love and infatuated with Mubarak and believed he was the greatest thing to happen to Egypt, but because I was concerned for the level of violence that might erupt and that Egypt might turn into a society like Iraq. And I think people are sophisticated enough to understand when someone is disagreeing with them out of a good place or a bad place. For someone to say, look, you know, I'm older, I've seen some pretty bad situations and some pretty ugly transitions of power. My ultimate concern is for the people of Egypt. That comes out of a place of sincerity. And so I think what allows religion to remain contiguous with itself are really, you know, certain core rituals which across the Muslim experience, Sunni, Shia, Ismaili, are pretty much the same. And certain attitudes towards community and to belonging that can take different form, but ultimately emerge out of emotional sincerity and genuineness. And that's where I think religious authority can sort of stick around for a little while this is all sorting itself out. Because nobody should presume to know what this is going to look like in 20 years. We have no idea. Right. Is the internet going to eventually settle into something we're all totally used to, like your landline telephone? or is it going to be a continuously destabilizing force which will provoke constant anxiety but also constant opportunity? And right now we don't really have a way of knowing that. What we do have in our tradition is the sense that scholars and teachers are there to help people. They're not there to teach the tradition in the abstract. They are there to respond to the people where they are. I had a discussion with a pretty prominent American scholar recently who had a really interesting point. He said, I can go teach any book from the Muslim tradition pretty easily. If I want to teach a course on Ghazali, I can teach that course. What's more challenging is for me to ask my congregation to say, what do you want me to talk to you about? What do you need? And I think it's that type of relationship where our education and information is shaped by conversation as opposed to simple imposition is where tradition should be going. And in that sense, I think there is continuity. Because the point of tradition is I'm trying to help people and help myself and become a better person and help the world around me become better.
Right.
And that obviously depends on where the world is at that moment.
I think it's somehow easier to do that in the United States for obvious reasons, because in the United States, you don't have this notion of state-sponsored Islam. You know, in the Arab world, in the Muslim world, places like Pakistan, you have popular Islam, if you can call it that, and then you have the state-sponsored Islam. And by virtue of being state-sponsored, it's politicized. And so even the notion of authority, we can't really genuinely say that's full religious authority and it's based on the tradition. It's heavily politicized. In America, you don't seem to have this problem. I mean, sure, there are local communities and local politics and things like that, but it's not a major issue. Do you think American Muslims are in a unique position to influence the development of the Islamic tradition because they have these intellectual freedoms where they can express ideas that would be considered heretical and even provocative elsewhere in the Muslim world? Because it seems to me when I look at the discourse in American Muslim communities, it's really rich. It's very dynamic, and there's a higher level of frankness and honesty, and people are much more willing to engage the provocative and controversial issues. So do you think you guys are in a unique position?
Yes and no. I think for all the reasons you pointed out, we are in a unique position, and the American Muslim community has certain strengths. We're very diverse. We're pretty small in number. We tend to have pretty decent resources considering the size of our population. But I think that in some ways we might be irrelevant to the global conversation. I think the reason people hesitate to say that in the United States is because being American, we like to think we're special and we have all the answers to everyone's problems. But America is a huge exception to the world and even to the Western world. It's kind of a weird country. It's a huge Western democracy that is also the largest Christian nation on the planet. It's a pretty religious country. It's a pretty isolationist country. It is disconnected from where the vast majority of Muslims in the world live. So while there are American Muslim scholars and intellectuals who have something to offer, at the same time, one way we can temper that enthusiasm, I think, is can the average American Muslim really relate to or offer much to people in societies such as you described, where Islam is a political and social reality, a majority religion with all the advantages and disadvantages that offers? What do American Muslims really have to offer to European Muslims where political identity is ethnicized? Those kinds of questions are tough ones. I actually think that some of the most interesting things in Islam globally will probably be coming out of Turkey and Egypt. Turkey, because of its unique historical trajectory, its wealth, its size, its ambition, and Egypt, because if this democratic revolution, inshallah, succeeds, you will have sort of the core country, at least of the Sunni Muslim tradition, suddenly become a much more open and dynamic place. And Egypt has instant authority. If you think back the last century to the big name scholars, I mean, even one of the biggest scholars in the West, Tariq Ramadan, is who he is by virtue of Egypt. If you think of Sohaib Webb in the United States, where did he get his training? Egypt. How many people
basically it's home of Al-Azhar.
Exactly. So in that sense, I think that there might be some really interesting things coming out of those developments. As both Egypt and Turkey have become more democratic, suddenly two countries that have historically been very important to I don't want to say international because maybe that's a little bit of an anachronism, but to a global or shall we say trans-regional Islamic identity, these countries are reasserting themselves, and that's very important for the way things are going across the planet. I think American Muslims have something to offer, but I also think that American Muslims might be a little bit too weird to really to really have something big to contribute. We're very small in number, and we have a very unique historical circumstance.
Right. No, I think I personally find the discourse there much more appealing, just, given my background and my experiences. So I guess that makes sense. I think, certain people definitely find it more appealing, but you're right. I think on a global scale, there are reasons that put you guys in a unique position, but, everything you just stated, that really does balance the picture. Before we wrap up, I just want to add one last quick question. You talked about modernity and tradition and how we need authoritative scholars who can navigate, both a traditional worldview and a, modern worldview. Now, one aspect of the modern worldview is science, and the scientific paradigm and the scientific method, and even things like evolution. So, if we look back in Islamic history, figures like Ibn Rushd, al-Ghazali, Ibn Sina, they were very well-rounded individuals. There were philosophers, there were mystics, there were theologians, there were jurists, there were scientists, there were poets, just extremely well-rounded. So given now our current reality and what you mentioned earlier about the need to produce scholars who are able to navigate these realms, don't you think that part of the training should be science and shouldn't just be focused on theology and philosophy, but and not science as how it's currently being discussed in Muslim public discourse? Because some aspects of it, I think personally, like it cannot qualify as genuine science. And if we look at science as science, like especially the leading edge conversations, we have some catching up to do. Like, what are your quick thoughts on that?
Quick thoughts. I think that from what I see of the Muslim world, and again, looking at it from the perspective of someone in the United States, one of the biggest weaknesses isn't necessarily the absence of science. It's the absence of the humanities in a critical and rigorous sense. So the absence of serious philosophical study, of literature, of understanding things from a nuanced perspective. I think one of the unfortunate things is we've had people in the Muslim majority world embrace science from a technological point of view very rapidly, and then that has spilled over into their understanding of religion. So they want religion to function like an equation. If I do X, then Y. If not Y, then Z.
Or even like reading science into the Quran and saying, oh, look, this was revealed 1,400 years ago. And then when there's a new scientific discovery that disproves the previous one, they have to reinterpret things and like, oh, look, see, it discovered this too. And you find that very, very widespread. And so I think we agree that it does need to be part of the training.
It does. It definitely does. I think that what really the issue we have is not Sharia or religion or politics. I mean, the biggest problem we have is most Muslims are not necessarily afraid of Sharia. They're afraid of the people who claim to speak on behalf of Sharia. Because they don't invest them with authority and they don't look at them with confidence. A lot of people I've talked to about Egypt recently have said, the more we think about it, the more we look at the Ikhwan, the Muslim Brotherhood, the more we think, do these guys really know how to run a country? If they were to have power, and maybe we should give them power to see what happens, can we really trust them to navigate all the nuances and difficulties and complexities? And that's where I think a scientific education is important, or at least an awareness of and appreciation of what's happening scientifically in the world as part of a much broader rejuvenation of the mind and the heart in the Muslim world.
To add to what you said and to conclude, many people deplore religion and assail it as if it's some kind of horrendous evil. I don't think religion per se is the problem. I think dogmatism, lack of critical thinking, us versus them worldviews, lack of just lack of humanity and an appreciation for other cultures. These qualities, and anything that's against doubt, that's against questioning, that wants to engage in just like a monologue and wants to impose itself on others, imperialistic tendencies. These exist in ideologies. Nationalism can get very ugly and can embody all of these sort of things. So these are the things there are. Extremely negative, and unfortunately, religion these days, the way it's understood, the way it's practiced, especially throughout the Muslim world, tends to embody these negativities, and it contributes to a very unfortunate situation. But that doesn't mean that religion per se inherently is horrendous or whatnot. And I think you would agree with me.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think one thing that very few people talk about, for example, we didn't really touch on, is capitalism. How do imbalances of global power, economic consumption, overconsumption, predatory finances actually affect societies? For whatever else, the Muslim world is, on the whole, pretty poor and unsophisticated. To what extent does the Muslim world really determine the trajectory of global politics? It tends to be responding more than it's actually acting, although I think recent months have proven a welcome exception to that. But I think ultimately all the things that people point out to as problematic in religion are problems of human nature.
Exactly.
If not religion, we would be fighting over language. And in fact, we have fought over language. If not language, then ethnicity. If not ethnicity, then economic policy. If not economic policy, then simply who gets what percent of the resources. I think it's just human nature. And I think actually it speaks to the power of religion and religious ideas that we tend to articulate these human conflicts in a religious language, whether that's because we really believe in them or we're just hiding from what we're actually doing to other people and to ourselves.
Right. Well, Haroon, I'm pretty sure we could talk for probably another hour, but we both have to run. And seriously, though, thank you very much. Very insightful.
Thank you.
And we'll stay in touch.
Cool. Take care. Assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum salam.